This session is on democracy, fragility, and human rights in the Lake Chad Basin. And it will be moderated by a multimedia journalist and CNN journalism fellow who was the host of the top-rated Morning Crossfire on Nigeria Info. She is currently the head of programs at News Central, a Pan-African TV station broadcasting from Lagos, Nigeria. And she has a media career spanning over a decade. Of course, she's interviewed several African creatives and consulted with NGOs to work on media campaigns to aid civic participation, government transparency, and accountability. It's my honor to bring up to moderate the session Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's please put our hands together as she steps forward. And she'll be joined on that session by very revered and very qualified panelists. Joining her on that team, we have a woman who is affiliated with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on gender, discourse, and political violence. She's an award-winning investigative journalist and has recently finished visiting fellowships at the Henry L. Stimson Center, as well as Transparency International. Her latest commentary on the rising spate of coup d'etats in the West African Sahel urges regional leadership and the reassertion of Africa's independent voice in global politics. And her latest policy blog reviews Russia's increased economic and strategic focus on Africa, and of course, how this is further muddling up complex conflicts in many African countries. She would also be making a paper presentation right here on the panel. Kindly make welcome Elor Nkereuwem. A welcome round of applause for her as she steps forward, please. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence. We also have on this panel the Pioneer Director General of the Office for Strategic Preparedness and Resilience, Nigeria's National Early Warning Center in the Office of the Vice President. And of course, this agency is an affiliate of ECOWAS Regional Peace and Security Architecture. He has previously served as Senior Special Assistant to the President on Policy Research and as Technical Assistant to the President on Justice, Security, and Conflict Prevention in the Office of the Vice President. Kindly make welcome with me, Chris Ngwodo. You're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today, sir. Welcome, sir. We also have the privilege to have here with us an associate professor in the Center for Peace and Strategic Studies, University of Ilorin. He was a 2019 African Studies Association Scholar, and he has over a decade experience in researching factors and actors, relationships, and issues shaping conflict, violent extremism, peace, and security in local, transnational, and global contexts. And of course, as a trainer, facilitator, and consultant to global institutions and development agencies, he's been a recipient of academic grants and fellowships for research excellence and academic residencies in the universities of Oxford, Harvard, and the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Center. Kindly make welcome with me, Dr. Gbemi Animasawun. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, sir. All right, so our dearest Elor Nkereuwem would be making a paper presentation, and of course the conversation would go on from there. But before that, we have another member of the panel, a beloved professor. We met this morning, and I can tell you a few things about him. So if we ask me that question, I'll probably pass. That's Professor Charles Ukeje. He holds a doctorate in international relations from Obafemi Awolowo University. He joined the university as a graduate assistant as far back as 1992 and rose to the rank of university professor in international relations in the year 2008. He has held several research and teaching positions around the world, and notably, he was a Fulbright Scholar at Temple University, Philadelphia, visiting research fellow at the Nordic African Institute in Uppsala, a departmental lectureship in African politics and development at Oxford University's Department of International Development, and senior advisor on the African Peace and Security Program at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at the Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. Of course, he continues to provide active technical and consultancy support to international agencies such as the African Union, ECOWAS, GIZ, DFID, FCDO, and key UN affiliates such as the UNDP, UNODC, UNITAR, and OHCHR. Thank you very much, Professor Charles Ukeje, for joining us today. And just before we get into that panel session, we'll be playing a documentary. I believe the media team is ready for that. So we'll have the documentary and we'll get into the conversation. Thank you very much.
Lake Chad Basin was the 6th largest lake in the world in the 60s. Over 70 million people relied on it for living. Problem, however, arise as the lake shrink from its original size of 26,000 kilometers.
Thank you to my guests as well. That's laying a bit of the foundation for the conversation we're going to have, but Elor is going to lay a wider or a deeper foundation as we get into that with her paper presentation. And at the end of the day, we want to look at the issues around democracy, fragility, and human rights in the Lake Chad Basin. And at the very beginning of that, you saw that the lake has shrunk. But I think if you look at the aerial images of Lake Chad from the 1960s and the 1970s to now, we'll really see the scale of the reduction. Lake Chad has actually reduced by about 90%. And that has put pressure on the lives of millions of people in multiple countries that depend on it for irrigation, for farming, for water, and of course we know the instability that has come from it. So let's get a deeper understanding of the background of the conversation and then we'll get into it. Please also don't forget we'll be taking questions as well. So prep your questions for this panel. We have experts here and they're definitely going to do justice to the conversation we're going to have. Elor, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for, attending my panel. Let me start by apologizing for my voice. I'm not sure I should be apologizing, but just making an excuse for the state of my voice. I have unfortunately caught a cold, and I'm hoping that I can project enough for you to hear me. And if at any point you don't hear me, just, kind of wave at me, so I won't be speaking to myself only up here. So this is a short overview of this paper that I did a little while ago for CJID, and it talks about democratic regression in Africa. And it's really based on, situated in the context of the rising spate of military coups that we've experienced, especially in the West African Sahel, and a little further down in Central Africa and a bit further up into Sudan. And this, this context, the context for this paper is also situated in the changes that we are seeing in the world today. just taking note of democratic regression and that not to unnecessarily focus on Africa and make it look as though Africa is the only country experiencing regression in democratic norms. And if we are seeing this outcome of coup d'etats in Africa, we should take note that we are also seeing other forms of regression in the rise in nationalism, even in the Western world. So we see the rise in nationalist politics in the US, in France, in Europe in general, and even I think in Italy as well. So to acknowledge that democratic regression isn't only evidenced, by military coups, but on the continent, one of the ways that we've seen this manifest itself is in this rise of military coups, and especially so in the past 3 years. Let me just go on with my slide so we can, kind of see what this map kind of looks like. So we see here, you see the West African Sahel belt. We see it's like countries side by side deteriorating into unconstitutional rule. And the interesting thing is that this has happened so rapidly in the past 3 years, making it a bit of a worry, because then you have questions around, is there some kind of contagion effect that is going on here? Are people seeing examples of military coups and imagining that it is possible, if it's been successful in another state, perhaps it will be successful in my state as well? And while that doesn't necessarily mean that the rising spate of military coups means that there is a contagion effect, it is enough to make us to ask questions and sort of interrogate what's going on and have a clearer understanding of what's going on, which is why let's just take a look at some of the countries. So we've had 14 attempts in the past 3 years. Take into consideration the fact that this is happening in the COVID era. One of the things I thought about, and it's just anecdotal, of course, is to say perhaps this is happening because the world over, other governments have taken an inward turn in politics. So although foreign policy is an important aspect of governance, we've seen many countries, and especially with the rise in nationalism, decide to look inward and focus more on domestic politics. So, of course, deprioritizing Africa and our leadership in Africa may have, and this is really in quotes, taken the opportunity to do what seems best for them. So taking international focus away from you perhaps gives you the impetus to go ahead and, enact some of these actions. But 14 attempts, so 9 successes in these countries. Bear in mind that military coups have happened 2 times over in certain countries like Mali and Niger, and the most recent one has been in Gabon. So moving forward, so what did I want to do with this paper? So I really just wanted to take a look at what the trends are. In political science, we tend to want to ask questions, what is causing the coup? So we're asking questions around causality. And to be fair, causality isn't something we can always answer factually, especially in the social sciences. And I, in particular, am reluctant to attribute one condition as a cause of another condition, because oftentimes outcomes are a product of complex and related factors contributing to this outcome that we're seeing. So sometimes, just talking about the cause of the military coups, it can be problematic and takes away from the kinds of solutions that we may be looking for. So in asking how should we think about this trend, here are the 3 main themes that, I have, and I mean just the general literature as well, contending with these issues that you kind of tend to see. And the first, of course, is the domestic political discontent in a majority of these countries. So we're talking democracy, we're talking about participation in democratic processes, and seeing that across the board in all of these countries that, military coups have taken place, that there has been a general sense of domestic political discontent, and most of them for an enduring period of time. So it isn't just that it started yesterday. In some countries, you've seen protests against, political outcomes, post-election violence, etc. So it's in Gabon, for instance, or Burkina Faso. So you know that across the board there is a level in which persons and citizens in the country are not satisfied with the democratic institutions in that country. Another thing, of course, is the uptick in violent extremism in some of these countries, especially the countries in the Sahel. And whilst we would say, how would this generally affect, why should this give impetus for coups to take place? But remember that some of the military coups that have taken place with a justification from the coup plotters and coup protagonists, saying that the countries and the democratic leadership have been unable to handle the rising security problems, and so have presented themselves as a solution to these problems. And just to take note, of course, that many citizens in those countries have also tended to agree with the coup protagonists, buying into this idea that the coup protagonists are in the right because they are trying to solve the security condition. So we see a sense in which people are willing to let go of democratic participation, even if just temporarily, in order to have security. Because at the end of the day, you must be secure in order for you to participate in democratic processes. But the final theme that this paper talks about, of course, is the geopolitical and great power contestations that have kind of contributed to these outcomes. We note, for instance, that the coups have taken place predominantly in former French colonies. And so we can't escape from the fact that there is a repudiation of France, and not just of France, but also taking the West in totality. So you see that these coups repudiate not just France, who is a major culprit, according to some of the conversations that we hear, but we see them conflating all Western organizations or Western states as part of the, this kind of rejection that is happening. And that is happening alongside an interesting embrace of a country like Russia as a willing foreign power that is going to support this so-called military solution to the domestic problems that these countries are facing. And I also want to note that, unfortunately, and as we all well know, that Africa continues to serve as the playing field for global power politics, and because of that, it is difficult to place the blame for these outcomes on Africa, because the solutions are not just mainly domiciled in African states. If there are external factors, if Russia and the US and whoever else and France is contesting for dominance in African states, in certain African states because of access to certain strategic resources, for instance, we cannot dismiss that as a factor that is contributing to the political unrest that we are seeing in some of these countries. All right. So how should we respond? So of course, we already have the ECOWAS, we have the AU responding to the situation. We also have key states in the region responding to this situation. Not sure how, if I'm doing something wrong. Okay. But the other thing I also want to note is that, so if we conflate these two actors together, we had seen what I think was a pretty reckless response from the Nigerian government as the head of the ECOWAS, threatening military action in, I think it was Niger, that action was threatened against. And I thought that, that was a reckless statement to make, because military action means that you are ready to sustain military presence over a period of time. And we know that kinetic approaches that have been adopted by the various states and various military alliances in the region have not led to peace, and have rather contributed to the humanitarian crisis that we see in some of these affected countries. So you just take Nigeria, for instance, and all the military action that we've had against, and counterterrorism, so military action against violent extremism that has resulted in not just losses of lives, but in the creation of these huge refugee and internally displaced persons populations. So, and you think about the suffering, the economic devastation, the socio-economic devastation that we've seen. So threatening military action is reckless at best and is ill-advised as well. So how should these states then respond, these actors respond? I advocate for diplomatic approaches that take into consideration the future and the big picture image of what to expect and what we can project will happen. So I say negotiate with the coup plotters, figure out an exit plan, work with them on the exit plan, because that is the only way to get out of this. If Gabon, for instance, says they're going to have elections in 2025, I believe, that we hold them to their word, that you can start to set up sanctions, a sanction system that holds them to account if they deviate from those plans. So the exit plan, I would be particularly interested in seeing an articulated effort from the institutions, relevant institutions, and key state actors as a way to ease everyone out of this, and also to kind of prepare this democratic response that we want to see in Africa, and to tailor-make these democratic norms that we want to see on the African country, on the African continent. So it isn't just about buying wholesale what's happening in the West, bearing in mind some of the challenges that democracy is facing worldwide. I also, of course, want to address the role of the international community. We've seen that bilateral arrangements, security or strategic arrangements, even economic arrangements, have not necessarily taken into consideration the overall benefits and long-term benefits for the African continent. And so one wants to see a kind of transformation in the approach that takes into consideration the fact that it isn't always that a bilateral arrangement that gives you access to the strategic resources that you need, and then in turn you prop up dubious governments in the name of maintaining peace. It doesn't help the African continent in the long run. And so the international community must come with a more circumspect approach in dealing with individual African states, and also in pulling resources together. So it does appear that we are working with the future of Africa in mind. And what is not necessarily mentioned in this paper is the role of the media. And my point is there's a degree to which we do not understand. People generally, citizens don't understand what a coup would mean. Many of us, if you're as old as I am, you remember the military era. You remember some of the difficulties, the socioeconomic difficulties. You remember the restrictions on freedoms. So when we are reporting about, people rejoicing in Mali, rejoicing in Burkina Faso, in relation to the emergence of coups, we need to remind people what this means. We also need to remind people that when people are rejoicing over the military connection with countries like Russia, we need to remind them that Russia has sustained information, what's the word I'm looking for? Warfare, disinformation warfare, and it's been strategic over the past 10 years. So just remember that this sudden love for Russia is not random. So you must situate this, you must tell your audiences what is going on. Don't just say solutions come in the form of military coups, because solutions don't necessarily come in the form of military coups. And it is the duty of editors to guide their junior reporters on some of these issues. So in summary, so this is what we've basically talked about. The international community is generally ambivalent when it has to do with relating with Africa. And we're not operating in an altruistic world. So we must make sure that we are looking out for our own interests. And like I said, the key regional straight response must, resist military responses and must engage in diplomatic exchanges to set exit plans, and to have certain peer agreements within the countries to set the tone for accountability between states. And finally, I would say that this is an opportunity for Africa to rise up and to have one voice that articulates our interests in the global scene, and that doesn't rely on external factors to shape us, but rather this is an opportunity for some kind of independence articulation of our own foreign policy interests. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to the audience and to CJIB.
Thank you once again, Elor. Please, a round of applause for her once again. That really helps us to situate the context of this conversation just a bit more. But we need to remind ourselves that all the conversations we're having right now on this particular issue focus on the lives of millions of people who are caught up in an intertwined humanitarian and security crisis in the Lake Chad Basin region. These are people who are Nigerians, they're Cameroonians, they're Chadians, they're Africans, and we need to be worried and concerned, even if we're facing ambivalence from the West and from other global actors, as Elor has pointed out. So just to start this conversation off, I remember from my time on radio, somebody called me one day and said, democracy starts at breakfast. And the simple statement meant that when we want people to be able to demand for their rights, to be able to hold governments accountable, to seek transparency, if they have not eaten, if they don't know where their next meal is coming from, the last thing on their mind is democracy. The last thing on their mind is casting their votes. The one thing they want to focus on is, where am I going to feed my children? How am I going to feed them? If my child is sick, how am I going to get health care for that child? So democracy starts at breakfast. And while we want to see the Lake Chad Basin area, region, whatever you want to call it, find itself rebounding and being rejuvenated, if we're asking them to focus and face democracy, are they secure enough for that democracy? Have they eaten enough for that democracy? So I want us to keep that in mind as we go into this conversation. So Elor has laid the foundation, and I'll just go straight to it with my questions for the panel here. And of course, please don't forget, we'll also be taking questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time because we want to keep things moving very quickly. But Prof, I'll start with you on my far left, and we'll just work this way. Yes, I am. Today I am. So I'll start with you on my far left. And in terms of we've seen a joint operation by many countries in the region, particularly trying to face Boko Haram. But we always hear about this land border issue, the porousness of these land borders, the inability of governments to secure these regions. So really situate for us, how porous are these land borders and how that porousness impacts or enhances the conflict we're seeing in the Lake Chad Basin?
Thank you very much, Tolulope. I'm most delighted to be here, and good afternoon, everyone. From that video, talked about 70 million people relying on the Lake Chad. So the first question to ask is, what are they doing now? What is happening to that 70 million? If 70 million people suddenly or over time find themselves not able to rely on a resource that has sustained them for centuries, a whole lot will happen. And this is what we're seeing. A friend of mine who is a geographer shared this same area, did his inaugural on the Lake Chad Basin, and he shared, area pictures. The place has shrunk considerably. So the question, therefore, is, what is happening to those people? How are they able to sustain their livelihoods in the face of the peculiar challenges that they face? And it's important for us to bear in mind that apart from food, because majority of them, the best form that God can appear is in form of food now. So what do you expect people who have lost hope to do? The chance to throw stones becomes attractive. And the same chance to throw stones, the same chance to carry AK-47. So we are faced with a peculiar challenge in that region that becomes very, very difficult for us to manage. So for me, this is the first point to bear in mind. The second point is to say that the Lake Chad Basin is not the only part of Africa that has porous borders. The whole of African borders are porous, okay? Between Nigeria and Chad, it's probably less than 100 kilometers. But if you take between Nigeria and Niger and between Nigeria and Cameroon, it's in excess of 1,500 kilometers. Poorly policed. The presence of the state is completely absent. I have a thesis that the more you move from major cities and capitals towards the borders, the presence and the reach of the state becomes limited. It shrinks. So as you move from Abuja to Borno, to the capital, Maiduguri, and then you begin to move towards the Lake Chad, the presence of the state is either completely absent. If you see any presence of the state itself, what you see is military, police. So, and when you have to put the police, the military in contention with the people, you know the implications of it. So for me, and another point to bear in mind is that if you take all the countries around the Lake Chad, they have shared histories, shared cultural values, and all of that. Okay, if you trace their history to the Kanem-Borno Empire, and that history continues to resonate today. It's not a dead history. Okay, so you barely not be able to see a difference between somebody who is from Borno and somebody who is from Chad or northern Cameroon. So it poses its own peculiar challenges, in my view, and we have to respond to this. So the point, therefore, is that because the state is absent, our borders have become a source of irritation. Our borders have become spaces where all kinds of things happen. Our borders have become spaces where criminal elements and armed groups are thriving. If you look at the history of Africa, most places, most conflicts that happen start from border areas, especially when those borders have vegetation that can provide cover. So you will see that the pockets of places around the Lake Chad where we're having serious issues are also places where, non-state armed groups, criminal elements have emerged. They have access to weapons because they can buy weapons in the open market, and they threaten the state, they threaten citizenry, and so on and so forth. So for me, therefore, the challenge is that how do we reinvent our borders? How do we begin to think about our borders and invest more in our borders, the same way, for instance, that we will invest in any major capital in Nigeria? If we don't make those investments now, we'll continue to see the peculiar kind of challenges that we see, in that region. Unfortunately, if this is not done, it's going to continue to affect us. I said that the Lake Chad Basin area is just about 8% of the whole of Africa, but you can see the multiplier effect of the Boko Haram insurgency and other local insurgencies that are happening in that space. You can see the multiplier effect for the rest of us in terms of the number of people that are killed, in terms of the threat to, local economies, in terms of threat to livelihoods, and so on and so forth. And it can only get worse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you. So, Dr. Gbemi, he's talking about protection, he's talking about security of lives, and I think the question about how we balance that, how we balance this need for security and how we balance human rights, it leads us into that natural conversation. So as I said, democracy starts at breakfast. And he's mentioned, of course, the militarization of these areas. These are ungoverned spaces. At the end of the day, you find that there are either proxy actors or non-state actors who've taken on, in some context, the role of government in providing some level of taxation and movement and security and protection. But when you are constantly in a sort of militarized state and that constant engagement between the populations, the military, and of course these non-state actors and these terrorists, human rights really does go out the window. So how do we balance the need? How does the state balance it without terrorizing these communities because you feel like sometimes they're protecting the terrorists, but meanwhile, you haven't been present in their lives and these are the people that they know that govern them and protect them. How do we do that?
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here. And again, it's unfortunate that we are discussing this. Professor Charles Ukeje and I were at Carnegie, if you remember, it's in 2016, to discuss this same issue. That we are discussing it again in 2023 shows, that it has not gone away. Now, how do we strike a balance between human rights, human rights and democracy? If I'm right. We need to understand fragility and its manifestations. Now, fragility is apparent at the national and subnational levels around the countries in the Lake Chad. If you take Nigeria's northeast, if you take parts of Chad, you see that the capacity of the states to govern has been eroded. Instead of the state being in charge, you have illicit actors, or those ones are called the oligopolies of violence, effectively governing these spaces. So how do we restore? We need to first of all restore the capacity of the state to govern its territories, first and foremost, without necessarily setting it up to militarize the people. So first, restore the capacity of the state to govern its entire territory effectively. Ensure that there's accountability of all actions, including what I call intelligence accountability, so that we don't hide under, the name of acting in overall national security or national interests, and now, eroding on the rights of the individuals. And for me, that's why we need to restore the capacity of the states to govern, restore institutional capacity to deliver. We need to strike a balance between providing human security, that is freedom from fear and want for the people, with the state taking the lead. Because on these issues, nobody can replace the state. So what we need to do is, after restoring the capacity of the state to strike a balance between state security and human security, we need to place institutions for ensuring accountability and transparency of all actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gbemi. So talking about accountability, ensuring that those who are supposed to take action, that will lead me to Chris, who's on my left now, because it's about strategies. I'm just, it's a game, but it's about strategies. And these strategies, we're not bereft of strategies. I heard it yesterday. I think I've also heard it today. Policy papers and putting things together is not Nigeria's issue. We're very good with that. We have some of the most beautiful laws in the world, if you actually go and look at them. They address issues, but when it comes down to implementation, those who need to take accountability and take action, we just seem to fly by the wind. So when we're looking at this conversation around strategies, Chris, what are those strategies, particularly working with international actors? Prof made the point earlier that Lake Chad is about 8% of Africa, but we're looking at 70 to 90 million people who have been displaced, a lake that has shrunk to 90% of its original size. There's just simply no way for us to ignore the magnitude of the impact of what we've seen before us. So what strategies have been in place? Have we seen any that have even been successful in at least mediating to some level the impact of what's before us in Lake Chad?
Thank you very much. I think in order to discuss strategy effectively, we must frame appropriately, and this is also about framing. And I just want to reference the idea of a democratic recession, whether in the Lake Chad region or in the broader Sahel. I contend that there is no democratic recession happening because the affected countries were not democracies to start with. And I think we must first of all accept that there were no democracies. I struggle to find any of the countries in the affected belt over the last 3 or 4 years where we had a spate of military coups that can actually be described as a democracy. And flowing from that is the idea that I think we make a mistake when we think of democracy as a destination rather than a journey. It may be more apt to talk in terms of democratization, in which case we consider how much progress are we making from point A to point B, from more authoritarian systems to more liberal systems. And if we're able to measure that and assess, then perhaps we have a better gauge for doing certain things. So if I say that what is happening in the Sahel or in the Lake Chad is not a recession, it's not a democratic recession, then what is it? I believe it's really something even bigger. I think it's a crisis of statehood, a crisis of viable nation statehood, where because these nation states have essentially failed to deliver on the social contract, millions of people have tuned out from those states.
and are seeking alternative constructs. Now, that alternative construct might come in the form of a military coup, which is something that historically has been the normative form of political action in our region, or it may come in the form of insurgencies, which we've also seen historically. In fact, if you take a much broader view of Africa's history, or even the Sahelian history or Lake Chad history, you could make an argument that democracy is the exception, that the window, the short time frame we've had of democracy makes it exceptional. Much of our history has been dominated by military rule and by armed conflict. So perhaps thinking of it that way, that democracy is the minority tendency, is better framing than saying that we're democratic countries, fundamentally democratic countries, that are going backwards. We're not going backwards. We were never going forwards. In many of these countries, they were not going forward. They had elected authoritarians, which is what happens if you define democracy simply as voting. Democracy is beyond voting. It's about constitutionalism, rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances. It's about access to social and economic opportunity. It's about representation. So a lot of these countries, and I'll focus, for instance, on the Francophone countries, what you find across the Francophone countries is that the elected leaders that were ousted tended to be above 60 or 70. Now, this is fairly superficial, but I think it's symbolic. Whereas the median ages of these countries that we're looking at were somewhere between 18 and 20. Already, that gap existed. The military officers that staged those coups were predominantly between their late 30s and their early 40s. So the population could relate. They were more relatable, quite frankly, right? So I think that when you create a situation where we have these electoral rituals that do not result in any of these real tangibles of democracy, then we set the state up to lose legitimacy, and that's what we're seeing. Now, if we are to talk about strategies, then surely some of the strategies we must talk about must address the decay of our political institutions, their lack of legitimacy, because that is also important. A state has no inherent legitimacy. If a state can deliver security and welfare and economic opportunity, people will give it its allegiance. But the moment they do not have that, they look for something else, whether in the form of self-determination or whether by casting their lot with insurgent groups. And if you look at the insurgent group, particularly those in the Lake Chad region, they have pretensions towards government, towards governance. So ISWAP in the Lake Chad is trying to create a Hezbollah-like state that will have social services, that will tax the people and protect them. So clearly, these are entities that are trying to supplant the state. So I think that any strategy must begin from that base, that you're dealing with a fundamental lack of legitimacy, and we must address that. How do we alter the nature of our political institutions and make them more inclusive? How do we deal with the ill treatment of minorities across the region, which is something that breeds political discontent? Yes. That, for me, is where this is going. You must anchor the political to the economic and then use the military. And I do agree completely that kinetic approaches are not often the best, but they have their place. Mm-hmm. But they must be seen as an accessory to this other thing of restoring legitimacy to the state and then providing a basis for meaningful economic existence for most of the people. Thank you.
You said something now before I moved to Elor, and that was about these non-state actors, these terrorist groups setting up, not caliphates, but setting up their own government and protecting the people from what?
Protecting the people from other rival groups. I mean, in northern Nigeria, in parts of northern Nigeria, specifically the northwest, not even the northeast, in parts of northwestern Nigeria, we have a situation where certain non-state actors are protecting communities from the depredations of those groups that we refer to as bandits, right? So the point is this: when people are sufficiently embattled, they will find succor from anywhere. So in Mali, for example, after the coups in Mali over the last 3 or 4 years, some of our partner institutions carried out research in Mali, and they discovered that outside of the upper urban middle class of Bamako, almost nobody was interested in restoring democracy. The most important thing to the people was who will protect us from the terrorist insurgents. And the military purported to be able to do that. I am convinced that in a few years it will become clear that they cannot do that, and then we will start looking for some other option. But that is the point, that people will seek solace from anywhere. They will create an alternative for themselves.
Prof, I saw you taking some points down. I'm going to come to you. I think it's around this democratic area of the conversation. But Elor, Chris raises a really good point, because my question to you was going to be around the fragility and how it's affecting democratic processes. But if we're at a point in time where we have to be realistic about just how democratic these countries were. So is it about processes or about sort of the interruption of their democratization, of their democratic journey? Because as he's noted, many of them have not been full-on democracies. They haven't really fit that definition of government for the people, by the people, of the people. So is it about the journey they're on and how it's being interrupted, how the fragility continues to interrupt the democratization that we would hope for? Or as he said, since democracy is not delivering, we like to use dividends of democracy in Nigeria, it's not delivering, and people are looking for who will deliver on security, relative, some kind of economic stability, and at least an ability to just know if I wake up tomorrow, this is black and this is white.
Thank you so much for your question. And I completely agree with Chris about democratic processes. I mean, if we were to take it in using minutiae elements, we would say, if we say democracy is a process, then perhaps they were at the start of the process of democracy. And so we cannot then offhandedly dismiss them as though they were in democracies at all. Because if they are at the nascent era of their democracy, then surely they are also democratic in that sense. And perhaps even when we consider that, we cannot then just define democracy as the performance of elections, but we do accept that elections are an integral aspect of democracy. But like he's rightly said, it's always been, often been the case of electing autocratic leaders and sustaining their interest in maintaining power. But then I think that the fragility issue in response or in relation to democratic processes, that it is a vicious cycle that one must take into consideration, because one gives birth to the other and one reinforces the other. You cannot at some point separate them. When he says, for instance, that say violent protagonists like violent extremist groups offer some kind of governance, and you rightly asked, protection from who other than protection from the situation that you have created. So we then turn to this vicious cycle that we are saying. But it is also true that the context in which violent conflicts emerge are usually in the context of those socioeconomic difficulties that emerge from poor governance, which is kind of how we define what fragility is. And once those systems are in place, and we should take note oftentimes that the actors that push for these changes are usually a minority, because it isn't necessarily that millions of people who are unsatisfied with the government then take up arms against the government. We always find that it is a smaller portion of the population, and people just kind of buy into it because they don't have any choice anyways. If Boko Haram is forcing conscriptions and is forcing you to join or not, I mean, like, you don't have any choice at this point. So of course you're going to have to make do. If we look at it as a process and looking at this kind of governance, this pseudo-governance that we see from non-state or proxy actors, we look at the processes, we will realize that it isn't necessarily that it is the will of the people to adopt them as as an alternative. In many cases, is that there is no alternative, and so you make do. But I also acknowledge that fragile conditions, of course, contribute directly to the truncation of democratic processes on the continent. So, say for example, the coups that have occurred, those have been en masse truncation of people's access to participating in elections. And that in itself is, a situation that has put millions of people in a space where they can no longer participate in electoral processes. But we also see, for example, in the case of Nigeria, where you've had that, poor administration of elections also lead to disillusionment, lead to people making decisions not to participate in the electoral process, because if you feel like your vote isn't really counting or that your vote isn't as significant as you would want it to be, then there's the sense of, why do I want to participate to start with? And exactly, and then it's also that fragility can also contribute on a lower scale to, the corruption of the system. So why would I want to sell my vote? If I have a socioeconomic condition that predisposes me to taking bribes, then perhaps I would be willing to, take that pack of Indomie noodles in exchange for voting a preferred candidate for some external person. So fragility and, the truncation of democratic processes, they go hand in hand. And, it's kind of like a vicious cycle that, ends up sustaining itself.
Thank you so much. Prof, I'm coming back to you. I think you had a few things you wanted to respond to from Chris, but beyond that, this fragility we talk about, when Elor was doing her presentation, we talk non-state actors, but we also talk the geopolitics of it. She mentioned Russia again. Many people don't know, Russia actually has a very extensive history on the continent. Russia was part of many, freedom battles or freedom fights for many African countries, particularly in the southern African region. So there is a history. Its history has just changed as its own political standing around the world has also changed as well. We know of that as well. And when we look at all of it, this fragility, let's be honest, it benefits some people. There's a benefit to having fragile African states. So that's the next place I want us to go after you respond to some of the things that Chris said. In terms of this fragility that we're experiencing, as you said earlier, it's not just Lake Chad. I don't know how many of you are aware of the situation that's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is absolutely nothing short of horrific, and it's something that needs to stop now because it's a battle for resources, and Africans are dying because people want access to our resources. So when we look at this fragility, as she said, it becomes a vicious cycle, and there are non-state actors, international actors at play here. What role should we be expecting from them, especially when we see their ambivalence towards these situations in the long run?
Thank you very much, Tolulope. I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there's a material base for democracy to thrive. The absence of that material base is responsible to what we see in the Sahel and in many of our countries, actually. That material base ranges from, the fact that more and more of our citizens, more and more of our, of people in different countries do not have access to subsidized socioeconomic opportunities. People wake up and there's no guarantee what is going to happen to them next. People don't have guarantees that they can walk safely to their farms, okay, without some guys carrying AK-47 or even more sophisticated weapons, threatening their lives. So the absence of this material base is a major challenge. And until we reinflate, until we create conditions that allows this material base to be restored, we are in for a long haul. The second point I need to mention is that the African state itself and the states in the Sahel, including Nigeria, the state itself is beleaguered. The state is facing several challenges. And when the state begins to face all of those challenges, it becomes increasingly paranoid. It becomes increasingly paranoid and it becomes increasingly punitive. And you could see it in several different ways. You saw that video. I was just telling Chris that, I'm going to have to ask CGID to edit a part of it where soldiers were killing people point blank. It's horrific. Otherwise you have to issue a viewer discretion before that. So what we are seeing is that the state and agents of the state are becoming part of the problem, exacerbating the problem, much as the non-state actors themselves. So at the end of the day, the citizens are caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place, where they have to contend with a state that is either absent or has become notoriously punitive, or non-state armed groups and criminal elements that basically exploit the situation. And so this is a major challenge that we face. And citizens increasingly are worse off for it, unfortunately. Regarding the question you asked about, how people thrive from in the context of chaos. Individuals thrive in chaos. There are people making money from Boko Haram. Tons of money, actually. Whether they route them through banks is a different thing, but they can put them in sacks. Okay? There are countries making money from the crisis on the continent. You always, if you think of Russia, for instance, or maybe even France, sometimes we just have to remove the goggle in our eyes and, look at things from their own perspective. Like you said, Russia has a very long footprint on the continent. The footprint is economic, the footprint is political, the footprint is military, the footprint is geostrategic. And as it begins to face its own challenges at home too, it has to look for ways to, improve itself, including, doing so outside. One of the things I've just done recently is I just finished a rough draft of a paper that I'm basically going to share with government to say that one way to engage with countries in the Sahel, especially our neighbors to the east, Chad and Cameroon, is for us to think of them the same way we invested almost 30-something years on ECOWAS and West Africa. For those of you who know what has happened in that region, Nigeria's interest, if you look at the density of Nigeria's involvement with West African countries, and you now compare it with our investment with our neighboring countries to the east, Chad, Cameroon, or even Gabon, where we have large numbers of Nigerians. Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria is the largest foreign ethnic group in Equatorial Guinea. There are over 5 million Nigerians in Cameroon, and so on. We need to make the same kind of investment we made in West Africa, in Central Africa, and we can no longer continue to ignore them, because the more we continue to ignore that region as a whole, especially the countries that we share borders with, will continue to have these kind of problems. And for me, this is a long-term proposition, but it's something that we have to begin to start that conversation right now, to invest more time as a country, in ECAS. Nigeria stands at a critical point, at a critical juncture between ECOWAS, West Africa, and Central Africa. Ignoring one part for the other has been a costly mistake, and it's a mistake that you could trace it back to the Civil War, where countries supported Biafra, and what is happening by ignoring them is basically a kind of punishment, for the Southeast. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it'd be impossible to have this conversation around democracy and fragility without also talking about the economic implications. And Dr. Gbemi, that's where I'm coming to you on this. How does this fragility we see in this Lake Chad Basin region, how does it impact the economic prospects? Because Prof just talked about the fact that democracy has to have a material base. People need to know that I can wake up and get a job and go to work. There's food to go and buy in a market, those kind of things. Americans might say the pursuit of happiness or protection of lives and property. A lot of our states are not able to guarantee and see that through. So when it comes to this fragility and the economic impact, what are we looking at? Then I'd also like to have a gendered aspect to it. I didn't want to ask Elor as the only woman on the panel, but I do need to applaud CJID for that, because oftentimes you have these security conversations and women are not represented on the panel in these kind of conversations. So please, a round of applause for CJID on that. It's very imperative. I've had these conversations many times, and what you find is that at the end of the day, women bear the biggest brunt of these situations. So let's look at the economic impact with the fragility, and then a bit of the gendered aspect of what's going on in the region, please.
Thank you very much. In terms of the economy, it is direct and negative. I say this because the economy in the area is built around informal life and the activities of everyday people, especially women in this area. So unfortunately, instead of the economy to be thriving positively, a kind of economy of insecurity has been built. And this is driven by subversive non-state actors. And Russia, let's be specific, through Wagner and some of their allies from Libya and all these places coming to, feast like kakas on what is happening there. So the economy is worse for it, and we can see that, look at the cost of, the fishing business specifically has suffered a lot. And that is also affecting availability of pepper soup in and other ingredients in the southwestern part of Nigeria. So that tells you that food security is suffering from it. The economy is also suffering from what is happening. And unfortunately, the economy of insecurity is thriving, driven by all these subversive non-state actors. In terms of the gender angle, this can make one to shed tears. When you see, looking at the documentary that was shown, and I've also worked in Adamawa, these states, since 2018. And if I tell you, the situation is getting worse. And that is why I feel when we are talking about fragility, we should not just be looking at it at the macro level. We should also be looking at fragility at the subnational level in terms of the erosion of state capacity and the calculated neglect by state governments of what is happening to the victims of insurgency and terrorism. Take, for instance, many of these women who are widows anyway and orphans are now in the face of what I call second level displacement. Because many of the state governments want to look good, they are closing these IDP camps. And if you walk around Abuja, you see many people. If you are somebody who walks out early in the morning, if you are jogging around, we say to many of these places, you see more women on the streets, more than the number that were there a year or a few months, 2 months back. So in terms of gender security, it is unfortunate. And for me, I think we have seen the implications, and we should begin to see how to get out of this. And one thing I think, thank God the government is represented here, the academia is here, and CGID, civil society, is here. It's important we begin to look at the issue of data deprivation. I say data deprivation because many governments are quick to say they reconstructed schools, they reconstructed bridges. But how long will it take you to reconstruct or to fix a victim of rape? Who pays attention to that? How long will you fix? How much are you investing in fixing the psyche of a boy who saw how the military killed his father? You say, what are they protecting them from? It's not hard now. If they can count in their neighborhood the number of people killed by the military, and they compare that with the number of people slaughtered by Boko Haram, if they do plus or minus, for some, it may be better to stay, they may feel better protected by these subversive non-state actors. So for me, we should not just be fixing infrastructure. We should be fixing the victims directly. And we need to address data deprivation in this area. And that is why CJID and the Office of the government here and we, the academia, should see ways of starting small, even if it means picking one local government to address all these issues, so that it won't just be all talks, because there are so many conferences. But what are we doing after these conferences? So fragility is getting worse at the macro and at the subnational levels. And that is what I think we should be, paying attention to. And in this regard, there's what I call data deprivation. And that is why we need, because it is when you know the actual data of the impact of these wars on the erosion of household earnings, human capital, access to education. That is when you can directly address the needs of the woman as a woman, an orphan, a widow. So I think we need to start small and,
And build up.
collaborate more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr. Gbemi.
Yeah.
All right, we're coming to the audience. I'll only be able to take a few questions, but I have one very quick question for Chris. This is about democracy. You've questioned if these countries can really be called democratic, but we can say they're on a path of democracy, a path of democratization. And I think sometimes we feel in this 21st century that it should be at the snap of a fingers, that everybody's educated, they're involved, they're performing, they're voting, they're holding people accountable. But countries before us have had 400 years of this to get it right, and even they now are struggling. We're seeing that democracy is not something that once you have it, it stays. You must constantly defend it. You must constantly build it up. So my final question to you before we go to the audience is this intersection between the democratic journey and the fragility we're seeing. Do you see a way out, a viable way out? And can it be done at an individual country level, or are we at a point in time where we have sat down, there's a joint multinational task force, but it just doesn't seem to be enough, that we're not cohesive enough in making this a conversation that needs to be happening across the region, the sub-region, and of course across the continent as well? Chris?
The conversation is happening and it's going on in multiple places. There are a number of initiatives. You've mentioned one, the MNJTF. There's the Regional Stabilization Fund that is supporting the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So there are a number of initiatives, a lot of joint multinational initiatives going on. But I do want to harp on the point that Prof. just made. Nigeria must take the lead. And it must take the lead because, at the risk of sounding immodest, Nigeria is the continent, or rather the region's natural hegemon. It is positioned at a very strategic crossroads between the Sahel and the coast, between West, Central, and Equatorial Africa. It has the landmass, it has the resources, it has the riches. It alone, really, within this region, has the riches. And generally, whenever we've had Sahelian crisis, major Sahelian crisis, or even major crisis within the Lake Chad, one of the measures of that is an immediate influx of people into Nigeria. What has happened to us over the years is that because of our own internal struggles, those internal struggles have cost us a bit of national confidence. And so we do not often realize how powerful we are or how much responsibility lies on us. I think perhaps you have to go back to the days of Bolaji Akinyemi at Foreign Affairs for the last time that there was that kind of broad strategic vision of Nigeria's place in the world and on the continent and its responsibilities within its sphere of influence. One of the things we have to do, and I think that there's a great opportunity to do it now, is when we think in military terms, there's a concept called strategic depth. And strategic depth refers to the distance between your borders and your center, right? So Nigeria, because of its size, has great strategic depth. It means that if you're thinking militarily, if there was a military invasion coming in, it will take a long time before it gets to your capital, just because of the distance between your capital and the border. Now, what we are advocating now is a situation in which Nigeria begins to think of its borders more creatively, not just our geographical borders, but can we begin to deal with certain things at source? There's a human capital crisis in our neighborhood, in our regional neighborhood. Through instruments such as the Technical Aid Corps, for example, can we address some of those things? We need doctors, we need engineers, we need medics, we need all kinds of people filling capacity gaps and helping the structures within our regional neighborhood grow as well. I must say, I know that this is a difficult way for Nigerians, especially Nigerians of my generation, to think, but the responsibilities that we have, given our resources, are inescapable. And I don't want to get into all that because he said much, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But the point is, we have the initiatives, the multinational initiatives exist. What we need is the leadership, in a very broad sense, broader, much broader than we've done previously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we're coming to the audience. I think I have time for about 5 questions. Okay, wow, 3. So we'll need to make them very short and tight. If you're directing them to anybody, please let us know. Okay, I'll start with the gentleman in front here. Please go ahead. Okay, microphone.
Thank you. The session has been a very interesting one. I'm Gbemi Animasawun, University of Oyo. I want to observe and ask a question. I want to observe that most of the African countries, I think it is all, well, maybe the South could be, extreme South could be removed from this observation. I think that the power sharing in Africa is mostly concentrated or a response to access to the control of resources, natural resources. And those who capture power are also capturing the resources and sitting tight to rule over the resources and use it for their own private
benefits,
private interest. And this has been the reason for which we have sit-tight leaders who are not interested in using the resources of the land for the betterment of the citizens. Wherever this could be, there will be people who will respond in terms of also coming in to have access to use it either for themselves or for the people around them. I think this is important, and not that these countries are poorer than to make the citizens better off or standard of living a little better if the resources were tapped and used for the benefit of the people. So the question is, don't you people see the connect between the people who sit tight in government using these resources for their personal betterment rather than the people? And again, if this happens to be true, what role can the press use what would be the role of the press or the role of the information managers in galvanizing the understanding of the people and also the making the people more aware? Because it is important that we also sensitize even the region, the people in the region, to understand the fact that the resources are not used properly, and possibly even the people should be made to rise against the leaders.
All right. Thank you so much, Godwin. Is this directed at anyone in particular? It's for anyone. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, please, let's take all 3 questions.
Thank you. My name is Bankole Adeshina. I'm a journalist and I'm a communications officer. I have 2 questions. One, is it about time to start rethinking our democracy? Because if the essence of government is to provide social good, and during the electioneering process, we see politicians coming out to say, we'll do this, we'll do that. And at the end of the day, when they are elected, they don't do this. Or you find out that the thing gets talked within the political party structure and doesn't get to the public. What happens? What is the alternative for the larger populace? What should they do? And the second is, when we are talking about democracy in the context of people must accept it because it's better, we have freedom of expression. Is our natural socialization consistent with the concept of democracy? I'm talking about check our homes, how we run our things. The parent want to have the final say. Check the institutions. The lecturers wants to pass a directive, even if it's not logical, you must abide by it. Check the institutions. Your boss wants to say it's my final answer, even if your boss is not right. Is this really the democracy we are preaching that we all must take?
Okay, thank you very much. I have, one final question here in the middle, the gentleman with the glass eye. Abosede, can I sneak in just one more question? The gentleman actually got up to make sure I saw him. Just one more, please.
Okay,
Thank you.
good afternoon. My name is Bivan Magoni. I'm a newscaster with Nigeria Info here in Abuja. So why are people always triggered when we talk about coups in Africa when democratically elected leaders have failed to deliver dividends of democracy? Now, I'm a big critic of the African kind of democracy. When you talk about African countries that are doing well, talk about to the north, we have Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. You know, those are countries that we feel like they're doing much better. When you talk about South Africa, or the southern part of Africa, only South Africa, but South Africa is sitting on the glory of apartheid. Now, when you talk about to the east, Paul Kagame is doing well. Now, there was a leader in Africa called Muammar Gaddafi. He led his country well, and his people were benefiting. But NATO and the US alliance got that man killed in 2011. There was a man called Sani Abacha in Nigeria who met inflation at 53%. And by the year 1997, inflation was down to 8%. We have the likes of Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who is seen as a tyrant. But Paul Kagame has led his country for 20 years plus and has united his people. No perfect leader is found anywhere. As journalists, as individuals, as whatever, as long as we are talking about Africa, we are talking about ourselves. It doesn't matter who is our sponsor. It doesn't matter who is bringing us together. When we start talking about Africa, we need to go back and be introspective about Africa. The future of Africa is very important, and it's very important we think away. We're talking about the coups, right? Okay. That was where I started. But let me ask, is democracy the best form of leadership for Africa? We need to go back and find what works for Africa away from the Berlin Conference, where African countries were brought together and shared amongst European countries that now see Russia as the enemy of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, one very quick final question, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My question is related to his, so I'll just loop on what he said to ask that is directed to the madam who made the opening presentation. You said that there's been disinformation, which is sponsored by Russian propaganda or thereabout. You made that statement in your opening presentation. So I wanted to ask, like which one? Because you comment that editors should guide their reporters along that line. So if you could give an example so that, you know, we could keep an eye out or you know, have a template to kind of see that this is propaganda from certain source and address it as such. Then my second question is, who do we expect Africa to look up to with all these challenges that we have kind of stated since the session began? Who do we now look up to as maybe a template for growth, integration, economic development, and all of that? When we continue to have people who are biased against other world powers like Russia, China. People just want us to follow the US and the European Union, you know, when we actually have other world power that are contributing significantly to the problems that, you know, face humanity today. China has led a very historic poverty reduction, poverty alleviation program in their country. We don't have a US template for that. There are homeless people in the US. US students can afford college, you know. We don't want that template here in Nigeria. So who do you want us to look up to?
All right, thank you very much. It's on my panel that we want to now revolt, but I like this. That means we were all paying attention and we're all very invested. Elor, I'll start from the back end. So he was asking you about the disinformation campaign of Russia. Russia's not the only one that's involved in disinformation campaigns, by the way, but he wants an example. He wants a template maybe that editors and people in media management, particularly for the press, wherever it's coming from, can work on to identify.
Thank you so much for your question, for your challenge. One of the most important tools that I was taught in journalism, and I have learned over the years in social science research, is to have a critical approach to considering issues that we face. It isn't enough to see data and buy it wholesale. You must always approach, in my view, every situation with that critical mind, to not accept one thing as fact, to interrogate fact. So when I say that Russia's disinformation, and we do have facts about what Russia has done in the past few years. So for instance, Russia has enacted a systematic information system in which it is passing on specific types of information, fomenting local support for certain groups and as opposed to other groups within countries like Mali. And you mentioned the Central African Republic. The issue with Russia and Central African Republic is so glaring. I don't even need to give you data. The data is available out there. One thing I urge young people to usually do is when you see this kind of knowledge being passed on about how military era people were enjoying lower inflation, for instance, then also let's ask ourselves. Last week or thereabout, we had 150 million return of Abacha's loot from France, or some information about the money that was stolen being returned. Why is that acceptable? Because he lowered inflation. We talk about the human rights abuses in the Abacha era. I think we've forgotten about the people that were killed. I think we've also forgotten about the journalists that had to escape this country because of the military era punishments that they faced. And if that is the case, you cannot then look at military intervention as though it is this innocent thing that is here to improve lives and to improve economic conditions. Military eras come with their own significant problems that are historically recorded. So we cannot simply make statements and refuse to take things in context. So you cannot repudiate democracy for the sake of repudiating democracy. You must have examples. And if you say China is an example, perhaps let's look at indices and why we cannot get information out of China about how citizens feel about the repressions that they face. The fact that we do not have access to that information doesn't mean we have to then act ignorantly as though those things don't exist. So I'm urging that we take a critical approach to whatever our preferences are, to say it isn't enough to say this works, this doesn't work. Let's be a bit more critical about it.
Thank you very much. All right, because of time, I'll need to speed through the last three questions, and I think they balance each other except for the one about the role of the press and also the connection between those who sit tight. But the main one I heard from the second and third gentlemen was around democracy. Is it working for us? Is it time for Africa to rethink democracy? We've taken presidential system, whatever constitutional system of democracy from the West. Is it a one-size-fits-all type of government? Prof. and Chris, one minute on that.
Okay, so everybody criticizes democracy. But you just if you take the name democracy off and you ask what are the essential elements of it? Participation, people having a voice. Are those things difficult to ask for? So just remove democracy for a minute. Don't use the word democracy. Just say democracy is about voice. Shouldn't people have a voice? Haven't people traditionally had a voice, even in our local communities and contexts? Okay? Participation. Are we saying that people should not participate in in taking decisions that affect their lives? So the point I'm really making is that don't let us begin to think about democracy as something that is completely alien. You understand? But it's something that we live through every time in terms of how people have to have a voice, including the voices of women. In traditional societies, in many parts of Nigeria and Africa, women have strong voice. You understand? But the moment we begin to couch it as really about democracy, we miss the essential elements that are very critical for our society. So rather than speak about democracy or whether democracy is good or bad, I am interested in, do you have a voice? Do I have a voice? Am I able to participate? Are you able to participate? Once those essential, am I able to hold those who are leading me accountable? Once I'm able to break it down that way, then it's fine by me. And for me, I don't think that is alien to Africa, because these are precepts and values that we live with. We just it requires that we constantly have to improve on it and find ways of making sure that it has meaning for the ordinary people. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Chris?
Whenever, no, he's just going to have to. Whenever I hear about revisionism around military rule, my first inclination is to ask, were you around during the era of military rule? First of all, because there's absolutely no basis for that revisionism. If we were under a military government, you wouldn't be able to have this meeting to start with. So there's no basis for this. It depends on what you mean by doing well and what you value the most. If the elementary regard for human life matters nothing to you, then by all means, military rule was great. But if you value your life and your ability to have agency over your own life, then there is no basis whatsoever for that comparison. Muammar Gaddafi was a plague on North Africa and on West Africa. He engineered coups, he funded civil wars, he's responsible for the deaths of millions. If you say Rwanda is doing well, and I know why people say Rwanda is doing well, and they always say things like, oh, look at female representation in the parliament. What good is female representation in a rubber stamp parliament? Perhaps the real question to ask is what happened to the women that actually aspired to be president in Rwanda? So we must interrogate deeper, please, okay? And lastly, what can the press do? We talk about fake news, we talk about disinformation. Can we all remember when 2 years ago, we all agreed, apparently, in the media, that the only criminals in this country were Fulani herdsmen? It didn't matter where the crime was committed. You would see a story about suspected herdsmen, and you read the story, there's no indication of who is doing the suspecting. The press has a role to play in this. The media has been the biggest, or one of the biggest vectors of division in our country. So when you talk of educating people, raising the consciousness of people, which is a democratic function, the media has a role to play. It's not just about government. Thank you very much.
All right. So we are wrapping up. They're begging me, and I know you guys have more questions, but that's part of what we're here for, networking during lunch break. Prof. Chris, Elor, and Dr. Gbemi are available to you, but please do not suffocate them, because I know some of you are not exactly completely satisfied with all the answers, but that's what we want. We want to bring these conversations on and, of course, lay them bare. But please, once again, a round of applause for all of my panelists today. I hope you've enjoyed the panel as much as I have, and I'm handing back over to our host. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Before you leave, a photo session.